Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Meso Terco, and you know what time of the month it is? It's the last Thursday of July, and that means it's time for the MiSTer FPGA News Roundup. All the fun things that happened in July released or were announced. And it's been another awesome month. I say that every month, but it is always true. We got a lot of stuff to talk about here. Before we get too far involved though, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined and want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But there's been a ton of fun in MiSTer in July, and we're going to be talking about it, some of my favorite things, some of the deeper cuts, and in between. Right off the top, obviously, if you didn't watch my video, I'll leave a link below. But the first retail Nintendo 64 game is booting on MiSTer. FPGAZumSpass, or Robert as I like to call him because that is his name, has been working more on the Nintendo 64 core. This was booting a few weeks ago, and nobody expected it to happen that quickly. Robert said he was hoping to have the first playable game ready by December. Well, let me tell you, it's still July. I think his calendar was slightly off. And you will see that it does draw some things to the screen outside of the One Namco arcade collection. But even seeing this progress is impressive in its own right. But Robert's been working on all of the different silicon that makes up a Nintendo 64. Because while there's not a ton of silicon on the motherboard, it is a pretty concise design, it is still a challenge to get that all working on MiSTer, and Robert's definitely down to the task. So if we take a look here, he's working on non-vector parts of the RSP, and that is part of the overall Nintendo 64 setup. Nintendo 64 is slightly different than Sega Saturn or PlayStation 1 in the way it works, but you'll see that the RSP chip is now passing all of the tests. This is deep coding stuff. It looks very visually interesting to me, but it is just a data set. But what this data set tells everybody is that all of the tests that would be required to pass for functional hardware on a real Nintendo 64 are passing on his MiSTer implementation. That does not mean that you're going to be playing a second game next week or next month. Might still be Christmas for game 2, but the speed at which Robert works, you never quite know what's going to happen. You're definitely not going to be looking at something like this next week, though. I want to make expectations very clear, but leave me a comment down below and tell me what the first game you're going to play on the Nintendo 64 core is when it is out, because I would be curious to hear what people want to see. Now moving on to the Sega Saturn side, we do have a new core in the beginning of July. SRG320 did update the core, and like every time he updates it, so many more games are working, so many more things are functioning, and a lot of the graphics have improved, things like shading and otherwise. We've been doing the Sega Saturn testing series, and don't worry, there will be another episode of that next week, and it is so much fun to follow along the progress with this core, and it's definitely the #1 core that I get asked about outside of anything else for MiSTer. Whether or not you think you should be testing it, whether it's worth playing, I can't really answer that for you. I absolutely love playing around with it and seeing everything that's working. Just don't expect to be able to finish games, and don't forget you can't save in it. But it's great to see SRG320 update the core, not just because we have something new to play, but because based on a situation where he lives, it's always him checking in and saying he is still good. But Saturn marches on, and it's so much fun. I feel like a year ago this was just kind of on the horizon, and now so many different games are playable. Something like the Saturn version Resident Evil here didn't used to get past like the first loading screen. Now you can basically play hours of the game. Or something like Hexen here with all of that shadowing and kind of depth in there. That is something that didn't used to work in the core. It was very flat color, but it's so much fun just to see something like this happen in real time. Just like Robert with the Nintendo 64 core and the PlayStation 1 core before that, having these builds and previews lets you see what type of work goes into making this work on MiSTer, and you can follow along with the process, because even though everyone loves a finished release core, I love testing these things, seeing what's working. There's a huge group of people that are testing as well, and as usual, if there's a game I haven't shown yet on a testing video, leave me a comment down below, tell me what you'd like to see, and I'd be happy to include it in the next video, because a lot of you guys want to see a lot of diverse things, and I love making that happen. Now moving over to Jotego's side with the Neo Geo Pocket, he has shown some previews of it working, and apparently every single game on the Neo Geo Pocket is now booting on the core, but they're all booting with different bugs. So it seems like Jotego and his team are getting really close to releasing this for that Patreon beta, but we are not quite there yet as of the recording of this video. He puts all his releases out on Friday, so it's possible you'll see it tomorrow, it's possible you'll see it next week, or it's possible you will see it next month. He has not stated any date other than he wants to get it done soon. But you can see here that this is how close he is, and don't worry about one being in Japanese and one being in English, just a different language option. But the changes he's making are very small, but it does seem like we're getting really close to Neo Geo Pocket. And I would highly presume after that Neo Geo Pocket Color coming close afterwards, because it is very similar hardware. But this is going to be a ton of fun of a core when it does come out, because there's a lot of good games on the Neo Geo Pocket. And this thing was such a failure in North America, I feel like most people probably have not gotten a chance to play it whatsoever. So hopefully by August news video we'll be talking about the Neo Geo Pocket core and saying it's out. Now I know everyone's going to ask, as you always do, Jotego and his team have not really said much of anything about the Capcom CPS3 after I talked about some of the schematic teardown work he had been doing. I know a ton of people are looking forward to this, not because the list of games, while small, is incredible, but also because the hardware is finicky and quite expensive to get a multi of. But I know Jotego's still working on it. Maybe it might not be this year, maybe it'll be next year. But before I start leaving all those comments down below saying I haven't heard anything about CPS3, I just haven't heard anything about CPS3. But tell me down below what your favorite CPS3 game is, or if you're even waiting for this core, because it seems like people either really want it or aren't interested in it whatsoever. And I think it depends on how much of a fighting game fan you are. Now, talking about fighting games and moving over to a different console, we did get the updated Neo Geo CD core recently, and that brought all of those loading enhancements. Because one of the major complaints about the Neo Geo CD hardware were loading times, we now have up to a 4x loading speed on the core, and you'll see here Metal Slug 2 side by side just how quickly it gets in-game with that 4x loading. The other thing is that Neo Geo CD support has been folded into the main Neo Geo CD core, so you don't have a separate core that you manually need to install from here on end. You can load AES, MVS, and CD games all in the same spot. Now, CD support is still not finished. It is still quote-unquote beta, and while every single game does work, you might see a little bug here and there with the CD loading speeds, but I do know it's still being developed. Just be aware that sometimes if it freezes, you want to go from 4x to 3x to 2x until you find a comfortable spot in which the core is happy with it. But it's so much fun to have something like this working on the system. I love Neo Geo CD. And while I 100% understand that people like AES and MVS more, there is a lot to love on the CD side. There's a lot of arranged soundtracks, there are some exclusive games, and a lot of the CD games have bonus features that are not available on the AES or MVS, so that is always a good time to get more of something you love. And a lot of the games, something like Twinkle Star Sprites, it doesn't really have many loading times whatsoever, because once it loads in, it's basically done. So don't believe all of what you heard about the Neo Geo CD. The loading times aren't that terrible. And like I said, now that it's folded in with the main Neo Geo core, there's so much SNK fun to be had on MiSTer. It's every piece of Neo Geo hardware ever made that's not called the Hyper Neo Geo 64, and that's just a completely different platform. But I just love this. There's so much SNK love on MiSTer, but tell me down below what your favorite Neo Geo game is. I really would be curious. And of course, you get golf. Best golf game ever made at 10 out of 10, hands down. I will accept no arguments. Neo Turf Masters is the best golf game that plays on any MiSTer core ever made, and you can now play it on the Neo Geo CD version in the mainline core. Tell me down below that's not true, I will probably ban you. All jokes aside, there is no ban button, so say whatever you want. Moving back over to Jotego though, he did release a Crime Fighters beta core, and this is on his JT Aliens core, Konami based. Now you're either going to love Crime Fighters or you're not going to like it. This is from a time and era in arcades. I didn't grow up with this really, so I'm kind of on the fence about it. I like some of Konami's beat-em-ups that came after this game, and while this one is not bad whatsoever, I just don't have that nostalgic connection to it. But it's another legacy Konami game that is now available to Jotego Patreon members and will probably soon shortly be in public. And I love that billboard there with the topless person, it just falls on top of you. Get too close, get too interested, you're going to take some damage for it. But it is fun to see another game get added on the Konami side, because I'm always so hopeful that after these things happen, we'll start getting some of the more 16-bit generation of Konami beat-em-ups, stuff like Violent Storm, etc., etc. They are some of my favorite beat-em-ups of all time, and I think Konami did an excellent job as a beat-em-up maker, so I can't wait to see what else comes down the Konami line. Now, another thing Jotego and Konami related is Haunted Castle has gone from Patreon beta to full public access core. And that's a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how much patience you have with what I would consider one of the cheap, hardest arcade games of all time. Now, I will give Haunted Castle some credit. It's got one of the best Castlevania soundtracks of all time, and I have been playing this game more recently to try to get into it. And while I still think it's one of the most absurdly cheap, hard arcade games ever made, not just in the Castlevania franchise, but in any franchise ever, I am starting to enjoy it ever so much more than just complete hatred for it. But you can now just use Update All. If you've got the Jotego updater installed, you should be getting this game and you can play it today. Just be aware, it is going to absolutely mug you for your virtual quarters. Now on the arcade side, also featuring Ghost but not featuring Castlevania, Phantasm has been released on the Coin-Op collection. Now this game is absolutely spectacular. It is so weird, it is so unique. You've probably never played anything quite like it. The hook of the game is you are a ghost and you can inhabit different types of characters, and this Tanuki looking fella right here is where I'm going to start. It's an action platformer that has great responsive controls, really fun visuals, an awesome soundtrack, and just a great gameplay hook. But you will also see that every time you take too much damage or do something else in the game, you're going to be able to leave the body as the ghost and inhabit a different character. Anything you see on screen can be taken over, and that is your new playable character. There's a ton of strategy involved in playing Phantasm. It is just a great action platformer that sometimes feels like a beat 'em up, sometimes feels like a run and gun, depending on the character you're using. You'll see here I jump into a character that has a firearm, and now I have that ranged attack. I just love this game because of the strategy. Not only is it charming and visually unique, but taking over different characters' bodies and using them throughout the game can prove to be a real strategy. And you'll see here that if you want to trade some of that energy away for an easier time, you don't have to platform across that chasm right there. You can just take the ghost, fly across, and inhabit the next character you see, kind of trading your life bar away for a little bit of an easier time, but definitely check Phantasm out. Now on the Coin-Op collection side of things, we also have Saint Dragon released. Now this is a shmup that I haven't played in some years, and that is available on MiSTer FPGA. I'm going to have to take a closer look at it, because it always just reminds me of sort of an R-type clone in some ways, but tell me what you think down below, what you see when you see this in action. But it is a ton of fun for a horizontal shmup, and it is a new arcade game that we get on MiSTer. It's so much fun to see all of these Jotego games come over. The arcades have such a massive roster of 8 and 16-bit hits, as well as deep-cut B-tier games, and that's what I love about MiSTer in 2023. We're getting a lot of arcade cores that aren't the biggest heavy hitters. Sure, there's still a lot of A-tier games we don't have on MiSTer, but I love to see that some of the B-tier stuff is getting love as well, and the Jotego Mega System 1 is just such a fun time to see, and it is not common hardware, nor are these common games you're going to be seeing in a lot of arcades, so it is great to have. Now back on the arcade side, and a core that's been out for a while but did get some updates, Jotego updated this System 16A and 16B core with some bug fixes, and I realized I never actually did a video on this core. So if you want to see a video in the future talking about the best games to play and otherwise seeing it on MiSTer, tell me down below. But it is fun to see some of these legacy cores get updates because they did have a few visual bugs here or there, or some other tiny performance hitches, and it is nice to see that even after these have been out for over a year, Jotego's team is still working on them and still getting them as close to perfect as is possible. I love that updating, and the System 16A and 16B have a ton of fun games as well, so if you've never checked them out, go ahead over to System 16, look at the list of games available. You're going to find something you want to play. It even has pseudo 3D with some of these sprite scaling effects in that kind of 2D dimension. There's a lot to love on 16A and 16B, and there's never been a better time to check the games out if you haven't played them yet, because Jotego did send those bug fixes out, so hopefully you're going to get an even better experience when you take a look at some of Sega's earlier arcade works. Now speaking of arcades, but not from Sega, we have Midway and Williams here, NARC, and Pramod has been running into a little bit of an issue with the memory bandwidth, and right now it seems like NARC and any other game associated with that hardware may require dual RAM. Now this is still a work in progress, and it's slightly possible that he will find some efficiency improvements here or there that could bring it down to a single RAM module, but for the most part, single versus dual RAM, I'd say like 95 to 99% of what runs on MiSTer runs on the single RAM, so we'll have to wait and see how that goes. Now the Game & Watch core did get updated, and Tiger handhelds work as well. I almost did a video on this, but I don't really care that much for Game & Watch, and I definitely had Tiger handhelds as a kid and did not love them whatsoever. They were the not great thing to have on the playground. But if you really want to see a video on this one, leave me a comment down below. Maybe I'll knock one up for a special bonus Friday episode, but otherwise I'm just telling you about it and kind of letting it go. Now on the fun kind of forward-thinking thing, work has started on potentially a Dreamcast core for MiSTer, potentially a Dreamcast core for a future FPGA device, or potentially a MiSTer core with an SH4 top hat that's kind of mixing hardware plugins with FPGA code. Electron Ash has gotten some things working in Verilog code with a mixture of C, and like I said in the specific video for this, this is very early stages. It does not mean you're ever going to be playing Dreamcast on MiSTer whatsoever. He is playing around, but a lot of times playing around and experimentation leads to some really fun things down the line. So if he gets more running, I will definitely update the video on that in the future. But the main takeaway for me this month is FPGAZumSpass, or Robert, has the first booting game for Nintendo 64 on the current core, and he is plugging away so quickly. He keeps saying he thinks he'll be like X% done in a month, and then 48 hours later he says he's already hit that mark. I don't know how he works that fast, but I'm hyper impressed, and I can't wait to see what August brings for the Nintendo 64 core. But those are all the fun things that happened in MiSTer FPGA land this month. Leave me a comment down below and tell me what your favorite one is and what you hope to see in August. For me in August, I definitely hope to see a new Sega Saturn update core, and I'd love to see a little bit more running on Nintendo 64. Might be wishful thinking, but hey, I'm a wisher and a dreamer, and that's what I'd love to see. For that, I'll be back next Thursday with an episode on MiSTer, and I'll have videos throughout the week, but July's been another hot month for FPGA, and I can't wait to see what next month brings. See you guys next time. Bye-bye.